Tonight our speaker is Anne Alexander, to be speaking on the fall of Assad, Syria, imperialism and revolution. I'll hand over to Anne.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me okay? So, obviously one of the things to start this meeting with is that there are huge numbers of questions swirling around what has happened in Syria over the past week or so. There have rarely been in the last few years such a quick transition of events that have seen the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime, a more than 50-year-old dictatorship crumbled in the front of what appeared to be a lightning offensive by actually quite small groups of guerrilla fighters. A lot of the questions that have come up over this have revolved over the role of the regional powers, the role of the major imperialist powers, the global powers like the US and Russia, the role of Israel, Iran, and Turkey as regional powers, and what relationship the events in Syria have to the ongoing genocide in Gaza and to Israel's assaults and aggression and war crimes against the Lebanese people. And among the debates that we've heard over the last week have come up actually also bigger questions. Is this a revolution? What are the role of the Syrian people played? What relationship does this have to the revolution that took place, that was ultimately defeated in 2011? What I want to do in this meeting is to try and ground an analysis of what happened in Syria over the last week or so in that kind of longer history of an understanding of revolution, counter-revolution and war in Syria, how that relates to struggles of ordinary people across the region, and to put forward a completely different perspective to the ones that are either those articulated by the Western media, by our own government, by the US and so on, which are evidently uncritical, utterly, or more than uncritical, of supportive of, for example, the Israeli crimes against the peoples of the region, but also write Syrians as an active agent of change out of history. But I'm also going to challenge some of the perspectives that look to one or other of the regional powers, in particular those that look to argue that there's a positive role played, for example, by the Iranian regime in the region in this respect, or some who have actually even lamented the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, or claimed that somehow this was a regime that was anti-imperialist or even socialist. I want to be very clear about this, that as revolutionary socialists, we stand with the people who tore open the doors of Sednaya prison. We stand with the people who want to tear down the doors of every prison, not only in Syria, but we also want to see the prison doors open in Morocco. We want Tora prison in Egypt, which has been a graveyard of activists for generations. We want that prison to be opened and torn down brick by brick. We also want to open prisons here. We are opposed to the way that not only states in the region oppress and brutalise their people, but also to our own state. And we also have no truck with apologists for the al-Assad regime. We have always stood on the side of people fighting that regime from below, of offering an alternative, of challenging it in whatever ways they could. And in terms of the label that is sometimes given to the Assad regime of a kind of progressive gloss, claiming it was somehow socialist, taking its kind of face value, occasional left-wing rhetoric, a regime that was handed on from father to son, there's a little bit of a clue there. That's not any kind of socialism that I think any of us would recognise. Syrian opposition it was very well known. Riyad Turk had a phrase for the Syrian state. He said it was called a jumlukiya. Jumhuriya is the word for republic in Arabic, and a malakiya is the monarchy. He made a mixture of the two, and it became a kind of hereditary republic. And that was, decades ago that he made that quip. And the regime from its inception has always been a vehicle for the oppression, the exploitation of the Syrian people, and played an utterly despicable role in relation to regional struggles for liberation. In particular, I would argue that of the Palestinians also was deeply repressive to Kurdish people, stoked up sectarianism, and so on and so forth. So, that said, I think that's a clear starting point that we need to focus on. But I want to talk now actually about the background to the events that unfolded over the last week or so, which I would argue the most important of these is the revolution of 2011 and its defeat. So in contrast to those who've argued that this is a simple continuation of the revolutionary process that started in 2011, I would argue it's the interruption and in fact the defeat of the revolution, the popular revolution, that created the conditions that both fundamentally weakened, eventually fatally weakened the Syrian state, but also the popular and democratic mobilizations, the incipient and embryonic forms of revolutionary movement that started developing in 2011, they were crushed, and different political forces came into that space. And it's very important to recognise that discontinuity, that breakdown, and the fact that this is not, even though the flag that is being raised over the Syrian capital today has 3 stars on it rather than 2, that it's not a simple continuation of 2011. So, what happened in 2011? Well, I think the first thing to say is that I would regard the revolutionary uprising that started in 2011 as one of the great chain of popular uprisings that shook the Middle East from in early 2011 onwards. Many people here will remember some of those events. Started in Tunisia, actually with the suicide of Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a vegetable vendor who set himself on fire in despair at the oppression of the police and triggered an uprising that then led to the fall of Ben Ali in January 2011, followed very quickly by the fall of the next dictator, Mubarak, of Egypt. In the Syrian case, the uprising began around the same time. It started not in the centre of Syria, not in the capital city, but actually in a town in the south, in Deraa, which is near the border with Jordan. And the background of the uprising was very much the impoverishment of the Syrian people over the decades in interacting with the incredible levels of repression and brutalization that they suffered at the hands of the dictatorship. Al-Assad's regime, Bashar al-Assad's regime, had long since abandoned really any pretense of the kind of original state capitalist, highly kind of state interventionist model that his father had set up in the early 1970s, which had focused, for example, on trying to, as well as build up industry, enrich layers of the peasantry, but through the intervention of the state. Bashar moved the economy in a much more neoliberal direction, with significant neoliberal reforms, although there was under the cover of continuing some of the economic policies of the previous generation, there was significant funding came in from the Gulf. And again, for those who like to see the al-Assad regime as somehow a bulwark against the influence of the Gulf, in fact, Bashar al-Assad, some of his last acts, while in power, were to cozy up again to the rulers of the Gulf. And this is a long-term perspective. The background of the social revolt that animated the 2011 revolution is extremely important, and in fact you could argue that it was a revolution that went from the peripheries of Syria towards the centre in some of the more marginalised areas, and often interacting with questions of oppression. The regime's response was from the beginning enormously brutal. In fact, compared to some of the other attempts by regimes to stop the popular uprisings, it was significantly more brutal. The al-Assad regime went and, for example, surrounded towns such as Deraa declared war on them effectively, bombarded them, following a pattern, in fact, that the regime had perfected under Hafiz al-Assad, his father. There was a famous uprising, attempted uprising in a town called Hama in the early 1980s. At that point, there was no social media, no internet, so literally the only people who were able to say anything about this, many of them were just massacred by the regime. The regime flattened the place. There was about 20,000 people were probably killed. And for decades, nobody could speak openly about this in Syria. And that method of kind of literally surrounding a town and bombarding it from the air was one that was then used in town after town by the Syrian regime. It sparked an uprising that turned into an armed insurrection. It turned into large chunks of the Syrian army. Soldiers deserted. They went to protect their hometowns, and groups of fighters started to come together to try and resist the regime. The regime retreated to the core areas of Syria, to the capital city, Damascus, and to the coastal areas, which are home to the Alawite minority from which the ruling family is drawn. But there's a question that arises out of this. Why was it that the capital city, relatively speaking, remained under regime control? It was always contested, particularly in the suburban areas, the rural fringe, the most marginalised districts, places like Douma and in the Ghouta. There was a lot of resistance. But the centre of this, unlike in Egypt, where Tahrir Square, the centre of Cairo, became under occupation, or similar areas in the centre of the capital of Tunisia and Tunis. At the centre of Damascus remained under regime control, despite efforts by revolutionary activists to break that. And actually, Aleppo, which was the second city, also, although that eventually fell to an uprising, it took many months for the breakthrough to occur. I think one of the large reasons for this was actually in contrast to the Tunisian, for example, and the Egyptian experiences. The revolution in 2011 was not preceded by a wave of mass strikes. In the case of both Tunisia and Egypt, there were significant strike waves both in the run-up to, over economic issues, 2011, and during the uprising itself. This was, I think, incredibly important because it meant that there was no transmission belt bringing that revolutionary energy into the workplaces. And it proved to be actually a very, something that massively hampered the ability of the developing revolutionary movement to paralyse the state and to, turn institutions that could be, were being used by the regime as part of its control mechanisms and so on, into places where ordinary people could organise for themselves. I'll give you an example of this. I interviewed a teacher who was an activist from the area of Idlib, who told me that he had led this kind of schizophrenic experience. At night, he would go out into the streets as a revolutionary activist with others, demonstrating against the regime, clashing with the police. It felt like the revolution was there in the streets and very much part of people's lives. During the day, during the day at school, his head teacher would turn around to him and the other teachers and say, right, we have to get on the minibus. We're going to go to Aleppo. Bring along the pictures of Assad. They would go into the streets, waving and chanting for the dictator that they were contesting in the streets later at night, and looking around and seeing tens of thousands of people dragooned into to take over public space. Probably half the crowd was looking around seeing, am I the only one thinking that this is wrong? But because there hadn't been that degree of workers' self-organisation, that the strike waves didn't convulse the public sector or industry to create that space for people to organise, it was very difficult. And I think that's one of the major issues that allowed the regime to maintain its grip on the centre of the country. This is, I think, part of the background then to the spiralling of the revolution into a civil war then into intervention by outside powers, as the regime was put under enormous pressure by the development of an armed insurgency, which was supported by regional powers to a degree. Also, large amounts of money came in with the kind of quite fragmented armed insurgency, involving quite a lot of Sunni Islamist groups, some of whom were the predecessors of some of the forces that we saw in we see leading the military offensive today. In terms of the background to the specific organisations, armed groups like Hayat Tahrir al Sham, that emerged out of the to play this kind of quite central role in the toppling of the regime from a military perspective. Their background is also at one step removed further from that, in a sense, because in particular in relation to Jolani, who's the leader of Hayat Tahrir al Sham, he comes from a background. He was part of the Al-Qaeda organisation, so he comes from a Salafi jihadist organisational background. He was a fighter in Iraq, actually, alongside Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi from ISIS, and was tasked with going into Syria to found a branch of ISIS in Syria. Later split with al-Baghdadi, actually because it seemed like he was on a trajectory towards a much more Syria-focused kind of political strategy. I think it's fair to say that he's moved towards a much more nationalist, Syrian nationalist perspective, wanted to overthrow the regime as opposed to having a kind of vision of a transnational struggle involving fighting in other countries or founding a new state that would be outside of the framework of the existing states of the region. He has also, and the people around him, have proved themselves more willing to work with other forces. They have somewhat moderated their very conservative, reactionary views to a degree where they're willing to work alongside people with different, with different religious beliefs, and so on. And so that in a sense there's an orientation around a much more nationalist strategy. But it is true that these are people who have very reactionary politics. They're very authoritarian, elitist, and repressive in the places where they've been in control. In the last few minutes, I want to, though, come on to the question of the regional perspective, and then bring that back together to try and understand how these different parts of the picture fit together, and why it is that the Assad regime could crumble so quickly. On the question of Palestine, there is a very long history of Syrian as a state being in the crucible of the impact of Israel's presence in the region. That since the Nakba in 1948, the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, the Syrian state has been, faced kind of waves of crisis as a result of this. It was felt very much in the 1950s, 1967, when, for example, the Golan Heights were seized by the Israelis, and pretty much every important juncture then. But what did the Assad regime have as its track record in relation to Palestinians? There was a huge amount of rhetoric from the regime that it was defending the Palestinians. Actually, it's often intervened in very destructive ways to the Palestinian struggle. One obvious example of this in the mid-1970s in Lebanon, when Syrian forces intervened on the side alongside right-wing Christian militias, the Kataib, the Phalangist forces, against Palestinians and the Lebanese left, in order to provoke a civil war, or in order to spiral struggle in Lebanon into a civil war, and to destroy essentially to destroy Palestinian resistance. Take what happened in the wake of the uprising in Syria in 2011, and the relations between the al-Assad regime and Hamas. Part of Hamas's leadership were based in Damascus. There's a large Palestinian community in Damascus, refugees. The Yarmouk refugee camp, for example, was one of the centres of this. The regime demanded of Palestinians that they should support the regime when the uprising began. And when Palestinians said no, Hamas refused to be part of this. They were forced to leave, and the Palestinians inside Syria, who were not able to get out, paid a terrible price. So every time the regime was, was given opportunities, if you like, or had opportunities to act in solidarity with Palestinians, it put its own interests over and above its own survival, over and above supporting Palestinians. So, in terms of the way in which the regime has presented itself, I think it's very clear that there was really I would argue, there was no benefit to the Palestinian liberation struggle from below to hitching itself to this regime. What about the question, though, of whether the al-Assad regime are part of a broader so-called axis of resistance involving Iran, Syria, and then Hezbollah in Lebanon? Is that, as some people have argued, the best way to support the Palestinian struggle? Again, I would actually argue no. I think that the so-called axis of resistance has shown its enormous weaknesses over the last few weeks. For example, if you take Hezbollah's role, Hezbollah has been one of the leading parts of resistance inside South Lebanon to the Israeli onslaught and the attacks that have spiraled over the border as Israeli military operations expanded to encompass destroying large parts of Lebanon. Despite the fact that Hezbollah actually intervened in the Syrian civil war on the side of the regime, again with disastrous and catastrophic effects, helping to accelerate accelerate this kind of sectarian conflict in part of the war, helping to save the regime, acting as ground troops for the regime. Bashar al-Assad didn't come to Hezbollah's aid in any way, shape, or form, as far as we could see, and Hezbollah was left actually to fight the Israelis alone. So, to that extent, the idea that there was some kind of bulwark there turned out to be completely false. I would also argue that the role of Iran, as seeing Iran as a kind of bulwark for anti-imperialism, is false. That the Iranian regime is a deeply oppressive regime, one which oppresses its own people, shoots schoolgirls in the street for their dress. Of course, we absolutely would oppose intervention in Iran. We would completely stand against, organise against, condemn and mobilise against any war against Iran. We're not in part and parcel of any kind of plans by our own government to manipulate the situation by pointing out the Iranian regime's crimes. But we have nothing in common with the people who run that state and are on the side of ordinary people in Iran when they fight against it. And this brings me on really to the last couple of points, because I want to briefly make an argument here for a different way of thinking about anti-imperialism. That anti-imperialism, I think, needs to be rooted in a tradition, a revolutionary tradition, a tradition of struggle from below, which has a social dimension. We have to understand that the role of the Israeli state in the region is something that's built into the way that capitalism works in the region. The reason it is there, and the reason it is supported by the big imperialist powers such as the US, and why they have structured this whole system that props up the Israeli state through interactions with other regional states like the Egyptian state, for example, the Jordanian state, and others, is in order to secure domination over the region and its resources, principally the oil resources of the region. And that in order to undo the oppression that is faced by Palestinians, it's not enough to simply resolve that at a level of national a national liberation struggle. Actually, you have to look at what preserves and maintains that state system. And that means taking a perspective that revolution from below is the only thing that can really undo this. So this comes back then to the question of, for example, the Egyptian revolution, that a different perspective, of an anti-imperialist perspective rooted in social struggle from below, would understand that the struggle of the working class in Egypt is just as essential. In fact, I'd argue is more essential to that kind of revolutionary perspective, which could really shake the system for good. To return to Syria finally, from this perspective, I think, although the situation is fraught with dangers, one of the things that there is some hope of is that now that people in Syria have a chance to breathe, if they have a chance to organise themselves, that you can create a space in which those traditions that we saw, at least in embryo in 2011, of popular organisation, of struggle from below, of a popular basis for solidarity between people of different religious backgrounds, between Arabs and Kurds, between Sunni and Shia, that can potentially be revived. It's something that is fraught with dangers, and we have to continue to organise ourselves against any form of intervention from our government, and continue to mobilise in solidarity with Palestinians, and to do everything we can to build as strong and resilient a movement as possible. And that requires organised revolutionary socialists at the heart of it. So that's really where I would end, that if you want to see a world that builds on the promise that we saw in 2011 and the hope of opening prison doors worldwide, then that's why we need revolutionary organisation. If you're not a member, really, you should be joining us.